Now, last night we gave the prizes away for the laureates for the Summit 2018, and now our two professors will tell us about how their initiatives will go about improving education for the next generations. First, we have Professor Larry V. Hedges, Yidan Prize for Education Research Laureate. He's chairman of the Department of Statistics, Board of Trustees Professor of Statistics, Education and Social Policy, Psychology and Medical Social Sciences, and faculty fellow of the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University in Chicago. We also have Professor Anant Agarwal, Yidan Prize Education Development Laureate. He is CEO of edX and professor at MIT. And of course, on stage once again is Tom BLACKWELL, CEO of EM. Please join me in welcoming the professors to stage.
So, professors, first of all, congratulations. Extremely well-deserved awards. And I'll start with a question to both of you. It's maybe to get our discussion going, perhaps I can ask you to give a very brief overview of what exactly it was that captured the imagination of the jury. And maybe you can put it into the context of what was the problem you saw and what was the problem you were trying to solve. Perhaps Professor Agarwal, I'll start with you.
Sure. As you look around the world, virtually every field known to mankind has been transformed by technology. Whether it's entertainment or hospitality or medicine, all been completely transformed by digital technology. And education certainly was adopting a technological revolution way more slowly. In fact, some would argue not at all. What we tried to do was apply digital to education and see what was possible. And when we started edX in late 2011 and began building a platform for learning, and when we first launched our first course, honestly, we had no idea how many people were going to sign up. And we had tested it to scale to about 200 or 300 students. And in the first hour, and we had no marketing, in the first hour when we just threw the course up there, we had 10,000 people register. And our team of a total of 3 people, then we all suddenly had heart attacks, saying, well, what the heck do we do now? But the beauty was, cloud computing allows you to enable to scale, from 1 to hundreds of thousands with a stroke of, I should say, with a keystroke, which is what we did. So fundamentally, what we're doing is applying digital technology to education, creating online approaches to learning, and how do you scale in a variety of dimensions? How do you scale in content? To scale in content, we partnered with a number of institutions, like Harvard and MIT and Oxford, and in the local region with Hong Kong Poly, HKUST and HKU, and also Beida and Tsinghua. And so we built a network of universities, and in Marshall Van Alstyne's terms, this is sort of the two-sided network effect. You have suppliers that create great content that brings in learners, and the more learners that come in, it excites professors to say, oh my goodness, this is amazing stuff, maybe I should do more. And so that keeps increasing, and soon, today we have nearly 20 million learners from every single country in the world and 140 institutional partners. And they're all using the content not just to educate people all over the world, but also to reimagine what is happening on campus. Just as one example, Georgia Tech, for instance, uses the same Python programming course on edX to teach the world, and they use the exact same course for campus learning. And you'll be stunned. The campus students, they've done A/B testing. The campus students actually, in their case, rated the online experience as better than the campus experience. And so we argue that even on campuses, professors should allow, administrators should allow students to take 10, 20, 30, 40% of all the learning online, so it can be a merge of online and in person. So that is the kind of revolution we are trying to create, where online becomes very synergistic with the in-person model of education.
Thank you very much, Professor Hedges.
Well, when I began being interested in education, the reason that I was committed to it was precisely because education was a vehicle for creating greater opportunity in society. It created wonderful opportunities for me in my own life, and I wanted that for others as well. But when I was a graduate student even, studying for my PhD, I recognized that education research had an awful reputation. Now, I had been a mathematics and science student as an undergraduate, and I was committed to the idea that scientific research is the way in which we can make progress in society on any issue. And I thought that should be as true in education as in medicine or in agriculture. And I recognized that one of the things that was true about education was not that there was a lack of research. Plenty of research had been done, and yet it didn't seem to add up to anything. There were studies that said one thing and studies that seemed to say the opposite, and no clear way of understanding what this chaos of research results might actually mean for people wanting to improve education. And I began to realize that some of the reason that that was true is that we didn't have coherent mechanisms, we didn't have methodology that would allow us to understand how to interpret the body of research that seemed to be so diverse and contradictory. And I began to work on ways to develop methodology to sort out what a body of research might mean as a whole. And that's what motivated me and my work for then many years to come.
If I may, Professor Hedges, I'll ask you a quick follow-up question on that. I can remember sitting down with the members of the jury when they were describing these projects, and there was a phrase that one of the jury members mentioned that really stuck in my mind. He said, "Professor Hedges, it's like he's given us new glasses to look at what really works." I wonder if you can help us understand that statement, and maybe in the form of a concrete example of when these new glasses allowed us to do something we wouldn't have been able to do previously, if there are any examples you can cite.
Well, I can think of one example that was very striking relatively early in my career. In the United States, there was a big literature on the question of how resources provided to schools was related to the outcomes of schooling. So resources like money spent per child and outcomes like academic achievement. And it sounds peculiar, but there was a very strong consensus among economists of education that resources provided to schools and the outcomes of schooling were unrelated. Now, this was quite a popular conclusion for some people in the country at the time, because as some of you may know, the American education system is the responsibilities for education are given to localities. There are 50 states, and each one has its own education system and its own mechanism for funding education. And at the time I was doing this research, there was actually quite a lot of litigation, quite a lot of court cases in which people were challenging the ways in which schools were funded in various states, and the argument being made in those challenges was that the state constitution provided that education was a right for everyone, and equal education, for adequate education for everyone was required by the constitution of the states, and that inequality of funding across schools implicitly violated that right that every student had to a good education. The position of the economists, which was that money was unrelated to outcomes of education, was a very convenient thing for people defending unequal funding systems. And one of my students, I was teaching a course on the work that I do, and one of my students pointed out a paper by a prominent education economist saying 20 years of research shows that resources are unrelated to student achievement. And he pointed out that the logic of the conclusion was precisely one of the things that I had explained was an invalid way of drawing inferences from a body of research studies. So we got interested in asking, what would the conclusions be if we looked at this very same research evidence, but applied more adequate methods of summarizing it? And much to our surprise, but perhaps not so much to our surprise actually, the evidence that had been understood to mean that school resources were not important in achieving education outcomes, in fact showed just the opposite. That work, I think, showed how the appropriate ways of summarizing research can lead to more valid and often different conclusions than people would arrive at using more naive and less adequate methods.
Professor Agarwal, I'll come back to you, and I want to ask a question about sort of data, use of data, protection of data. And I'll give you an example. I was in Moscow a couple of days ago talking to a well-known fintech professional called Chris Skinner, and he made a comment that stuck with me. We were talking about it in the context of free services or WhatsApp or whatever it is, and he said, you know, if you're not paying for the product, it means that you are the product. Now, if I try and apply this to what, in fact, you're doing in education, you're sitting on this sort of mound of data, and incredibly valuable data and insight. To what extent, on the one hand, how do you protect that data, and how do you ensure data protection? Or on the contrary, is there pressure to use that data and monetize that data in order to be able to continue doing what you're doing?
You know, data is a double-edged sword. You have to, and particularly when you are working with students, and particularly younger children. The edX platform has learners ranging from 5 years of age to 97. And we have to really be cautious about how we treat the data. On the other hand, we are gathering every single mouse click from learners, and not only over a period of time, but also a large number of people from all over the world simultaneously. So we have terabytes and terabytes. We have what I call the big data of learning. I like to think of edX as a particle accelerator for learning. And so you can imagine the incredible kinds of learnings that can come out from research done with the data. So the challenge is, on the one hand, how do you protect the privacy of individuals? At the same time, how do you do research so that humanity can benefit? And we try to make a trade-off, and here's what we do. On the privacy side, we are very careful not to share the data for any profitable interest. There are many for-profit companies that will sell you a discussion forum, for example, at a university, and I won't mention names, but they refuse to promise that they will not sell the data to employers and others. Many of them have come to edX and said, hey, will you integrate our discussion forum with your platform? And I tell them, we will do so, but you have to make it open source, and you have to promise not to share the data for profit. And they say no to both of them. And as a nonprofit, we tell them, no, then you're out. So we protect data. On the research side, what we do is we've established what we call an RDX, a research data exchange, where all the university partners who opt in can share the data from all university partners. And we anonymize the data to the best we can. You cannot provably anonymize data, but we do the best we can, and we share the data. And some amazing results are coming out. I'll just give you one simple example of a result that Philip Guo, who's a researcher at the University of California, San Diego, came up with, which is, for a long time, people did not know what's the right length of videos. What do you think? How long should videos be to maximize engagement for learners? What do you think? How many minutes should a video be for maximal learner engagement? What do you think? Yell out the answer. 3 minutes.
I had a 10 over here, I think. Any other numbers? 3, 10, we take it?
No, but how come none of you are saying 1 hour? Because all our lectures are 1 hour. So he did a study, and he showed that 6-minute videos were the optimal length. And today his paper is being cited by everybody, and what he did was he analyzed 5 million video watching sessions, and that's an example of big data that in one fell swoop can answer a long open questions as to what is the right length of video. Just one example. So I think we have a responsibility to keep up the privacy. At the same time, I think we have a responsibility to analyze and study and improve learning outcomes. And I think keeping that balance is going to be very important and challenging.
Perhaps I can ask you one more follow-up on this. So you've clearly stated your policy and your model here, and that sounds like the ideal balance, and you're in a position to continue developing that. But as the potential value of technology in this world becomes more and more, do you see a risk that this becomes more of a private sector game and more entrants who come into this field who will be motivated by different considerations and won't necessarily have the same ethical balance? Do you think that's going to happen, or will education stay to some degree protected?
Education will not stay protected, I'm sorry. I think we're already seeing examples in the US, the big battle between for-profit education and non-profit education. And particularly the previous administration had clamped down on a lot of the excesses of the for-profit industry, where the profit motive superseded public good. And so I think one of the reasons when we formed edX, we said this has got to be a nonprofit, was that I think our fundamental motivations are not to maximize the ROI for the investor, but how do you maximize public good? And I think that in the education space, don't assume for a moment that just because it is education, certain interests won't exploit the usage of data. Now, that is not to say that all for-profits are going to do it, but there will be, or all nonprofits are not going to do it. I mean, clearly, I think people have to be ethical about it and make sure that, particularly in the education space, particularly where we have younger children involved, we got to be very careful, because there are studies that have shown that, so let's say, for example, some platforms capture keystrokes of people. Studies have shown that you can predict illnesses based on keystrokes. Many of them are also, it's not good for accessibility. And so the question is, that is scary. Imagine if that data is available, and as you're growing up, a company out there knows exactly what illness you're going to face 7 years from now. I mean, this is scary. And so, and with education, where all of us come to trust a system of education, we have to be particularly careful to protect the data and to be, just take our responsibility very seriously.
Thank you. Professor Hedges, I want to ask you a question around sort of public policy and regulation, and as it might relate to your area here. And I'll cite one example that I don't know if any of you saw, many of you probably did. There was the moment when Mark Zuckerberg was dragged in front of the US sort of Senate and the lawmakers, and they were all being tasked with coming up with a framework to sort of regulate this sort of new area. And it was very clear from every single one of the lawmakers that none of them had any clue what it was that they were asking questions about. Now, so your area is not an easy area necessarily to understand, and I wonder whether the people who make policy and the people who think about regulation, whether these are people who actually understand what it is that you do. Is that a risk? Does it sort of challenge the idea of coming up with the right kind of policy to be supportive, or on the contrary, does it give you free rein to continue to develop?
Well, I think one of the things that is always a challenge for scientists or any other kind of scholar is the challenge of making sure that the work that you're doing is both understood by those who can use it and not misused by those who understand its potential. And I think that the issue of regulation is quite important, I think, for some of the reasons Anant was referring to. Human nature doesn't end at the boundary of education. All of the same human tendencies that are going to manifest themselves in the education space as they do elsewhere. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. But what I think it makes essential for us is to recognize that we have regulations, we create regulations in order to put bounds on the ambitions and the human tendencies that are going to be there inevitably anyway. And so I think, for example, the process of public policy making is best understood as an incremental process of improvements. I think that we flatter ourselves if we imagine that any policy we implement is fully understood by us at the moment we create it. I think the history of experience in public policy making is that we make policies with the intent to achieve some end. Then we discover the ways in which those well-intended policies are subverted by human nature, and then we try to make better policies that essentially correct for the mistakes that we were unaware of in the first round of policy making. If we think of the policy making process more as an incremental process of improvement rather than deciding the complete and perfectly adequate policy when we begin, I think we'll have a better perspective on how to make good public policy. And I think that it's not necessary for policymakers to have deep technical knowledge, but that means that it's extremely important for those of us who do work in a more technical sphere be able to provide them not only with explanations but with intuitions about what we're doing, so that they can better understand what the consequences of policies might be.
Professor Agarwal, in your space, if you pick up on this public policy angle, I mean, how would you assess sort of public policy environment? Are there particular challenges you come across when you're trying to do what you're doing?
Where do I begin? Trying to find the biggest challenge is like choosing between your children. But I think there are quite a few challenges, and I think the biggest one, and I'll speak for the United States. I think it's true in India as well, but I'm familiar with the system, is the accreditation system. And I'm sorry to say this, but the accreditation system in many countries is very much like the taxi cab system in Boston. For those of you who are familiar with the taxi cab system in Boston, they give taxi cabs medallions. So to have the privilege of driving a taxi cab in Boston, you have a medallion. And so they limit the number of medallions that they give out. And so these medallions become incredibly valuable. And in fact, until 7 or 8 years ago, these medallions owned by a lot of, for-profit companies were worth like $1 million, $1.5 million. And then Lyft comes in and Uber comes in and democratizes, who can drive, and suddenly these medallions are worth 20 cents. And so, I'm not sure how to say this, but I'll say it bluntly. Frankly, in the education system, accreditation is very much like a taxi cab medallion system. They've created a scarcity where only certain people, certain institutions can grant certain credentials. Now, the original motivation is completely valid. In the taxi cab industry, the motivation was to maintain quality, I think. But ultimately it became, how do we prevent progress? How do we prevent people from coming in? How do we protect the status quo? And frankly, that's what has happened in education, where for new people to come in, for innovation to come in, has become really, really hard. And there are accreditors that only allow a certain number of people to give out either degrees or certain kinds of credentials. And I think that is a real challenge to progress. Many countries are trying to change that. In Hong Kong, for example, I heard, I'm really pleased, they are looking to really radically innovate in the accreditation system, and in other places as well. And so I think until we are able to allow newer forms of learning, more modular forms of learning to get accredited, we're not going to have the same kind of progress. Our industry is going to be held back, just like the taxi cab industry. And you really, really have to rethink the way accreditation is done in order to have true progress.
And could I comment on that? I think that Anant is making a very good point. Monopolies introduce inefficiencies, ultimately,
Right.
even if created for good purposes. But on the other hand, there was an original purpose for creating accreditation systems. Right. And in the United States, as you alluded, the people take advantage of the possibility of for-profit education. So discovering the right mixture of regulations and openness is the challenge I think we face.
Yes. Well said, well said.
Can I ask you one more, Professor Agarwal, a question around sort of kind of quality, how you ensure sort of a consistent degree of quality as you expand this? Because, you know, where's the balance between quantity of accessibility but quality of what people are accessing? A question you could no doubt speak about for an hour, but maybe for 1.5 minutes.
It's a really good question, and we focused quite a bit on access. You know, edX put out 5 Reimagine Education goals for 2022. The first one is dramatically increase access, and the second one is make a step change in education quality, both on campus and online. We're trying to create a number of ways in which to improve quality. I'll give you some examples. One is, because the platform is open source, anybody in the world can add new assessment types. And today our platform has 54 assessment types. And as an instructor, you know, you salivate when you think about that. If you think that all we do is multiple choice, you know, I really want to disabuse you of that notion. There are 54 assessment types. I mean, you can do all kinds of ways of assessing students, you know, drag and drop, image responses, you know, really, really cool stuff, and that goes to quality. The other thing is, as edX, how do we ensure quality among our courses? We do a couple of things. One is we've developed what is called a Mooc development checklist, MDC. Many of our institutional partners did not take kindly to us calling it a quality rubric. So we changed the name to a Mooc development checklist, which was much more comfortable to adhere to. And so it's a long checklist of things. We will not put up a course on edX unless you adhere to all of the items in the checklist. One just example, the pedagogy of the platform is active learning, which means that you provide content and then you have to allow the student to engage themselves by, for example, interleaving videos with exercises and discussions. And so the platform enforces that. The second example is we built a tool on our platform where when you create a course on edX, the tool will tell you to what degree your course adheres to these guidelines. So as a professor or a course creator, you get some feedback on, you know, this metric is somewhat low. Now, we're taking a leap of faith that those metrics relate to quality. But at least we are trying to build these tools and checklists to ensure that we are improving the quality of education in as much as we are increasing the access.
So we have just over a couple of minutes left, and if we don't finish on time, I'll never be invited back to moderate. And so I'm going to ask you each one final question and ask you to be brief in your remarks. You've both been the recipients of the Yidan Prize. As we all know, there's a significant amount of funding that comes with that in order to help you do more of what you're doing. The question to both of you, what's next? Professor Hedges.
Well, I intend to use the benefits from this prize to help support the effort of scientific evidence to become more important in education policymaking, and to support the role of scientific evidence in society from some of the challenges it faces. Unfortunately, scientific evidence is being challenged in my country and others around the world. And it's important that those of us who believe in science as a way of knowing, as a special quality of knowledge, take steps to defend it, at the very least to make sure that we're not doing things that critics can use to undermine our work.
So in our case, you know, and again, you know, it's a huge network of contributors to the whole effort that edX is. Our university partners, our learners, the edX team, and so on. And we plan to use the prize for the following. our current effort, if you look at where we've been able to make an impact, the biggest impact has been in lifelong learning, where as technology disrupts various businesses, people have to keep learning throughout life. And our biggest impact, as we measured it, has been so far in helping people learn and stay abreast of where technological changes are taking them. In the future, or the next 3 to 5 years, we want to use the proceeds to truly reimagine the undergraduate degree. We would like to see anybody, anywhere in the world, to be able to get undergraduate class education. Now, why do we have admissions? I mean, have you ever wondered when something is a human right? I mean, just imagine if you had a village had a tap which produced water. One could argue water is a human right. Can you imagine if there was a thug sitting there and saying, all right, what's your SAT score? Before you can tell me your score, unless you tell me your score, I won't let you get some water. I mean, can you imagine we have admissions for education? It doesn't make any sense. So can we create and reimagine undergraduate education where anybody, anywhere can get access to education and use technology to eliminate these false limits that campuses create? Can we do that? Can we modularize the degree? Can we create stackable credentials so that people can learn as little or as much as they like and get jobs? So we want to use the prize to foster a class of innovation leading to truly reimagining the undergraduate degree.
So for the avoidance of doubt, this water is available to you. Please feel free to take the glass. But so we're out of time, which leaves me simply with the opportunity to once again congratulate the winners of this year's Yidan Prize. And if you'll join me in a round of applause for some great answers and some great work. Keep up the great work.